With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being here on the program on Tactics, whether you're watching us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Periscope, or if you're listening to us tomorrow on not tomorrow, Saturday on News Radio 1440 on the rebroadcast. We are certainly glad that you've chosen to make us a part of your busy day right here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. As always, I'm your host, Caleb Colquitt, and we have a lot to talk about, and this week has really been just insane from a news perspective, and I've also been trying to get some kinks worked out on the technical side here in the Tactics studio. But ultimately, I got to the end of the week and I realized I probably only had time to really prep and really dig in to one story. And there was so much going on this week. We all know that what's going on with impeachment. We all know what was going on with the Wetumpka Tea Party, forum that we covered. And actually that wound up taking up 2 episodes because we had so much local content for you. And so eventually I had to make a decision. And I thought, what is the most important story going on? And I'll tell you right now, it's not impeachment. It's not Iran. It is not all of the stuff that's going on between the Republicans and the Dems. And right now, honestly, I don't even think that it's our local elections and stories that are going on right now. Right now. Looking back at the week, I think the most important story that I could cover, the most important one that I could talk about, is what was going on in Virginia. I think that has to be the number one story, and there's a couple of reasons. First of all, you guys know what a constitutionalist I am, and of course it deals very, very directly with a constitutional right, but that's not even the reason that I think it is the most important, because I think it's what that fight represents. It's far bigger than Virginia. It's not even just a nationwide fight. I think it's a fight that affects all of us individually in certain ways. And I'll explain myself periodically through going through this story as to exactly why this is the most important story. But I think that it's important first to give you a little bit of context and help you understand so that you know why I'm saying that this is the most important story. So to give you some background, you have to understand the origin of the story, and that's what we do here on Tactics. We dig deep into it. We try to make sure you have all the context so you have a fuller understanding of each story. That's why we don't cover as many stories, but we go far more in depth than the ones that we do cover. So the Democrats won what is known in political circles as a trifecta, and what a trifecta is when you take the executive branch and both houses of the legislative branch. And in the state of Virginia, they have a bicameral house and they have a governor, of course. And so that's how you take the trifecta. And that means that Democrats have essentially control over all of the government, with the exception of the courts. And I don't know exactly what the Supreme Court breakup of Virginia is, but that's really neither here nor there. The Democrats barely won this by about 10,000 votes. Now, to put that into perspective, that is 10,000 votes out of a population of 8.5 million. Now, I know that the entirety of the population doesn't vote. I'm not trying to say that, it's such a tiny percentage of the overall population, but it was a larger percentage of the votes. But ultimately, that means you have a state with 8.5 million people and a lot of varied opinions on that. And for the Democrats to take the majority, that means a lot of the people of that 8.5 million, roughly half, had to agree with the Democrat position on a number of issues. But it's not exactly like they got a landslide and a mandate on a lot of this stuff, and yet, despite having a very tiny percentage, now they still won fair and square, I'm not griping about that, But despite having a very tiny percentage of the population, more than the Republicans, saying, yeah, we want to go with you guys, we want to go with your plan, what happened there is that they started trying to push through some of the most radical gun legislation, I would argue the most radical gun legislation in the entire country. I mean, it straight up rivals California and New York. And so that's something that's really important to understand, is that they barely got over that threshold to be able to do this. And this is actually pretty similar to the gun legislation that Governor Ralph Northam, a Democrat, had proposed earlier, but he didn't have control of the House and the Senate in the state of Virginia to be able to pull that off. Now he's bringing it back, even though they were wildly unpopular amongst a lot of Virginians. And remember, too, that one of the very first things that they did when they took power is they made it very difficult to impeach the governor of Virginia. They actually rewrote part of their laws to make it more difficult for the governor to be impeached, because they wanted to be on the safe side before they went forward with their radical agenda. They wanted to actually rig the game, as it were. It would kind of be like paying off the refs. It doesn't guarantee that the game will go your way, but it definitely helps. And I'm not saying they cheated. Like I said, they did this fair and square, but it was underhanded. Not necessarily against the rules, but certainly against the wishes of a lot of people. And this is one of the things that I have an issue with a lot of people in government in the first place, is that they never think into the future. They never think, there might be a Republican governor of the state of Virginia, which, by the way, has just recently really been a purple state. It's been mostly a red state for a large portion of at least my lifetime. And they don't even seem to think into the future. Well, there might come a time where there's a Republican in office that needs to be impeached because he's corrupt, and it'll be really difficult to do that with these new rules. They don't think about that. They think about what's happening with the here and now, and as long as it's their people doing it, then somehow I guess that makes it okay. But this is the situation they find themselves in, and remember that this is Governor Blackface Northam, who was actually, they found a picture of him, and they never did figure out whether he was the guy in blackface or the guy in the Klan hood. There's really not a good option there. But this is the same guy that if it was a Republican, they would have kicked the guy out of office before the day was over. The woke crowd would have not tolerated somebody like this being in office. I'm really kind of surprised that, I'm not surprised at their reaction to it, because of course he's a Democrat, but you would think that at least some of the people on the woke side would come out against Northam, but it's been largely radio silence. And this is also the same guy that out and out openly advocated for infanticide. You remember, and we showed that clip on the show here, where he talks about what's going to happen is we're going to take the baby into the other room after it's born, and then we're going to go and have a discussion with the mother about whether or not to keep that kid alive. I mean, the guy openly, in public, endorsed killing a child after it's already born, which the abortion on demand is already something that is not approved, but by, I believe, 13%, if my numbers are right in the statistics. Only 13% of all Americans nationwide, California, New York, all of it, only 13% of people actually support late-term abortions. And Northam's like, oh, I don't even care if the kid's alive. We can still kill it even after that. That's who this guy is. And yet, despite all of this, the Congress still made it more difficult for you to impeach the governor just so they could go ahead with some of their radical policy proposals. That's where we are right now. That's the context in which all of this takes place. Here's another bit of context that you need to know, because the way that the media has cast this, you would think that some great crime has been committed here, because the media, and I won't go into a whole montage of it now, but a lot of people took issue with the fact that these events were happening on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, because of course the rally did happen on this Monday. The problem with that is they don't realize that in the state of Virginia, this is a long-standing tradition. Martin Luther King Day, because everybody's out and because you're off work, it's long been a standing tradition, and they actually open up the Capitol building, they open up the State House to let citizens kind of come and do a meet and greet. They have to still schedule meetings and all of that stuff, but it was a way for regular citizens to get to meet and to converse with in the capital of Richmond some of their elected officials. That it's been that way for as long as I could look back. I tried to look into some of the history of this, and apparently this has been standing for decades. And even though this hasn't been going on decades, for the past several years, there is a big gun rights group in the state of Virginia. It's kind of like a statewide version of the NRA, if you will. And that group has been holding a rally on Martin Luther King Day to meet with elected officials for a really long time. And so that's the reason that this rally grew out of that smaller protest, and it started really picking up steam because there was legislation that was proposed by the Senate, passed by the Senate, or is fixing to be passed by the Senate, and they believe that Northam will sign it into law. Which, I mean, if you're okay with infanticide and blackface, I kind of doubt you would have much of an issue with curtailing a person's constitutional rights. But anyway, by the way, I mean, you look back at Governor Northam, that dude is the consummate Democrat, if you understand the history of the Democrat Party. Blackface, in favor of abortion and even killing kids after they're born, and also radically anti-gun. I mean, remember that the whole reason that gun control was put in place in America in the first place was to try to disarm black people so they couldn't defend themselves against people like the Klan, which either Ralph Northam or his college buddy dressed up as while the other one was in blackface. It all kind of comes full circle. But anyway, so it's important to understand all of this because Northam declared a state of emergency on Friday that would last all the way through Monday, which automatically meant that anybody that had firearms would not be allowed into the designated area where they would have been in the past. He did that specifically so the group that was going to come there and protest like they had planned to beforehand would not be able to get onto the state ground. So what they did is they still, a lot of them, some of them didn't, some of them disarmed and went in, and there was sort of a airport security kind of checkpoint that you could go into the state grounds on. But a lot of them just kept their firearms on them and open carried and stood outside the designated area, which is fascinating on a number of levels, but I'll get to that in a little bit. But I want you to understand here, the reason that this is so incredibly offensive is because Governor Northam is essentially saying to the average citizen, you must disarm to be able to speak to me. I don't want to even have a conversation with you if you were the kind of person that would do this, that would come on to state property with a firearm. You see, there is an assumption there that they are going to do something untoward. You are treating regular citizens who have done nothing wrong, and the only thing that they want is to be able to talk to their elected officials like you and others, to talk about how they believe that their rights are being infringed and the things that they wish that you would do and listen to them on. And yet you're treating them like criminals. You're saying, no, we have to assume the worst, and because of that, you have to disarm to get anywhere near me or to have this conversation with me or the other elected officials here on the Capitol grounds, even though that's a rule that had not been a stipulation in the past. This is the problem, that you're treating innocent people that have done no crime as though that they are criminals and have need of extra scrutiny and suspicion. So it's important to understand also what is in this new legislation, and we'll go through this as quickly as possible. But when it comes to this, there are bans on several popular guns, making not only the purchase of said guns illegal, but also the possession. That's important too, because with a lot of gun laws, including federal gun laws, they have something known as the grandfather clause. So if you happen to own something that is now illegal to sell, if you already own it, well, that's yours. You know, maybe they wish that they could go back in time and keep you from buying that firearm back then, but they can't, so they just grandfather you in. You're allowed to have that weapon even though it's illegal to be sold now. Even some of the more liberal states have this, that if you already have the firearm, you're already in possession of a magazine that has over the legal limit that you're allowed to sell, or whatever the law is in that particular state, It's okay if you already have it. We're not going to come after you if you already have it. It's just you can't buy that anymore. Not so with Virginia's law. With each of these, there is no grandfather clause. And so if you just happen to be a regular citizen that made a legal purchase, your legal purchase, which, by the way, a firearm can get pretty expensive. So it's not exactly like, buying a set of plates or something. I mean, this is a major investment. Then you probably did a good bit of, if you're like me, did a good bit of research and comparative buying and all this stuff and went out to purchase a firearm. And now they're saying, no, you have to turn that into us because merely possessing this object, which, by the way, you used to be able to possess, you no longer can. It's absolutely absurd. So this includes a shotgun that holds or can accept magazines of more than 7. Which is problematic on a number of levels. A lot of popular shotguns now do have a higher capacity than that or have magazines that you can feed into them that hold more than 7. So it's obvious that this is a problem. Any semi-automatic rifle with a fixed capacity of more than 10 rounds or has a thumb hole stock, pistol grip, or hand grip. Now, this is one that's really absurd because, as I've said many, many times on the air, the problem with a lot of these gun control legislations is they have nothing to do with the actual functionality of the gun. It depends on whether or not you have a thumb hole stock, a pistol grip, or a hand grip. Believe me, if you get shot, you have no idea whether the guy had a hand grip or a pistol grip or a thumb stock grip. That's not a thing. All you know is that a bullet went through your body. And it hurts exactly the same amount. The bullet travels at exactly the same speed as it would if you had fired from a different gun with a different stock. It's absolutely absurd that these people that know nothing about guns, obviously, are the ones that are trying to keep them from being sold or possessed by the average citizen. And the 10 rounds thing is really stupid. Let's actually go to the statistics here, because a lot of people don't realize this, because I realize that the Second Amendment is not for self-defense. That was not the reason that the Second Amendment was put into the Constitution. But let's pretend for a second that it was. They'll say, well, why do you need more than 10 rounds? Well, if you're an expert marksman, a really good shot, one of the best of the best, you probably could drop several intruders with just 10 rounds. But let's say that you're not somebody like that. Did you know that the average amount of ammo that is expended to take down a single perpetrator is 3.5? This is the average person, not Rambo, just the average citizen that, probably goes out and target practices at least every now and then or just for fun. That person needs 3.5 bullets on average to take down a single perpetrator. Let's say that you're, a single mom, and you try to get out to the range as often as you can, but you got 3 kids and there's not a husband in the picture, and so you don't exactly have a lot of time to practice your handgun, and because of that, your aim is still okay, but it's certainly not as good as the average person would be. And let's say that just 2 people invade your house. Well, if you're below average, let's say you take 5 rounds to drop each one, you better hope there's not a third guy, because you're out of luck. If there is a third guy, you don't have enough ammo, and you'll have to actually physically reload your gun. You see, that puts the other person, because if you're a perpetrator, you don't need as many rounds, because you're there to threaten or to rob, or, you may even be able to pull that off with an empty gun as long as they don't know that it's empty. And you only have one person, realistically, that you have to take out. And let's also remember that if you're a burglar, the element of surprise is on your side, so the odds that you're going to get off a successful shot is actually in your favor in that particular situation, if you don't mind shooting first, which, criminals tend to not do. So with all that with all that in mind, you can see why needing more than 10 rounds is actually pretty logical. Now, I'm a fairly good shot, but I would guess that I would probably be, close to average, maybe a little above average. I carry 14. I have a 13+1 in my personal firearm. And that's because I know that I may need some extra ammo in case I'm in a situation where I have to take down multiple targets. Or shoot, I mean, if there's just a lot of cover, maybe even the same target. And so this whole 10 round thing is just, it's absolutely absurd. And only a person that is completely devoid of understanding or has never thought through these kind of processes are the ones that would make rules like this. They also banned any semi-automatic pistol with a fixed capacity of more than 10 or weighs more than 50 ounces, which is another thing that's really stupid. The weight of the gun has absolutely nothing to do with the functionality. In fact, a heavier gun helps reduce your recoil. And recoil can cause you to misfire or cause you to not be as accurate on the second or third shot. And we already talked about how the average person needs at least 3.5 rounds to take down a perpetrator in a situation where there's a defensive use of firearms. Well, let's say that you have a lighter gun, you're more likely to A, miss, or B, hurt someone else. Now, I'm not saying that any gun that is lighter than 50 ounces is some kind of death machine that's going to be spraying bullets in all directions. I'm just saying that it's hilarious to me that these people are trying to ban the guns that would be the most dangerous, and in doing so, they wind up favoring the guns that are actually more dangerous. Granted, not by much, but it is a difference. You can tell these things were written by people that have no idea what these are, and this would ban a lot of, virtually every popular concealed carry self-defense pistol. Virtually every one. Very few of them now, except maybe your 45s, which just have larger rounds, and some of your really, really small concealed carry, like what most people think of as a backup, have less than 10 rounds in it. Your average semi-automatic pistol that people use for concealed carry for self-defense have more than 10 rounds now, and several of them weigh more than 50 ounces. I never even thought to weigh a gun because it has nothing to do with the gun's effectiveness. And that would also mean that any kind of AR-15 is automatically banned. And remember, that is the most popular, best-selling rifle in America, which means an awful lot of gun owners will all of a sudden overnight, if this passes, go from being perfectly law-abiding citizens to fugitives that can be found guilty of a felony for possessing something that they possessed yesterday legally. And yet we're supposed to believe that, no, they're not coming after our guns, they're not coming after your AR-15s, no, it's all fine, we love the Second Amendment, we're not coming after you. Bull crap. Because this is the kind of stuff that Democrats do when they don't have a check against them. They also want to raise the buying age to 21. This would also include the owning age. You're also not even allowed to own a firearm, even if your parents bought it for you, which shouldn't need to happen since you're over 18 and an adult. And 18-year-olds can be in the military, where we kind of trust those guys with guns. But they want to raise the age to 21, which has no effectiveness on things like mass shootings. You remember I did a segment a couple years ago where they were talking about the shooter there in Parkland. And they were making a big deal about raising the age to 21. And yes, the guy that committed the Parkland shooting was under the age of 21, but we actually did a cross-analysis of all the mass shootings in the past 20 years and found that only 2 out of the, I don't know, a couple dozen, I think, mass shootings that we could find over the span of that time, only 2 of them actually were under the age of 21. Most of them are middle-aged men. All outdoor ranges would be banned, which also makes no sense. Now, I have no problem with indoor ranges. I've never actually been to one. But the reason that they're doing this is because they want to restrict where people can go and shoot their guns. I thought if we were trying to promote gun safety, we would want there to be more opportunity for law-abiding citizens to go out and practice and try to, do target practice, see how accurate they are, how they can improve their shooting. And yet we're trying to get rid of all the gun ranges? That doesn't make any sense. That would necessarily mean that you would have an awful lot of people who are less proficient with their firearm and more likely to misfire, to not be able to use their firearm effectively. Everything in this goes against the idea that we want there to be law-abiding citizens that are proficient using their firearms. It's because they don't like the idea of average citizens having firearms in the first place. And have you also noticed that indoor ranges are significantly more expensive than outdoor ranges because they require more maintenance? There's a load of safety measures that you have to take. An outdoor range just makes more sense. And when it comes to the next one, universal background checks. Now, when they say universal background checks, the average person, the average citizen, thinks, oh, you're talking about just background checks for everybody purchasing a gun from a store, right? No, we already have that. When they say universal background checks, what they're talking about is a background check if you just transfer your gun to somebody that you know. If I have a friend that I've been friends with for 20, 25 years, I now have to go through the state, go through a legal process just to sell him a gun. Or if I transfer my gun to him, if I just inherit a gun from somebody, I have to go through a legal process. This is a step away from gun registration. It's a shoehorned in way because the thing is, there's no way to monitor this. There's no way to have truly universal background checks on all personal purchases unless you do go to a registry because there's no way to enforce it. And this is the slow roll where they're going to do this and they say, well, we actually can't enforce this law unless we have a registry and know where all the guns are. That's where this is eventually heading. And the idea that they should be regulating those kind of sales anyway just doesn't make any sense. Illegal for anybody to authorize anyone under 18 to use a gun without adult supervision. Now, I want you to think about this. Think about how many ways this could go wrong. Let's say that you're a father of 4 or a mother of 4. Your oldest son is 18, and you have 3 daughters. Somebody breaks into the house. Now, you've instructed your son, who, by the way, is a expert marksman, even does competitive shooting. I mean, the guy's phenomenal at it. You've told your 17-year-old that if anybody were to break in the house or to threaten your daughters, then he is well within his right or ability to take one of your firearms and take care of and defend his family. That's something that he's allowed to do. You've just committed a felony by doing so. If you instruct and give authorization to a 17-year-old, even if they're a very proficient shooter, and if you've ever seen some of the teenage marksman competitions, you'll see that there's some teenagers that can really shoot a gun. If you say that, you are committing a felony in the state of Virginia if this passes. And so if that takes place, unless there is adult supervision, and you're telling them if there's a situation like this, you may be the one going to prison for someone else breaking into your house, and you have no idea who that guy is. He could be a murderer, he could be a rapist. And what happened is your 17-year-old, in fear for his life and fear for the lives of his family members, went for the nearest weapon that he could find, which happened to be a rifle or a shotgun of some kind. If that happens, and you're the one that instructed him that it was okay to do that, you now can go to prison for a very long time. But we're supposed to believe that they have nothing against law-abiding citizens being able to use these. This thing is a nightmare. This could also make a person that is a instructor. So if you're an NRA instructor or the instructor at your local gun club, a hunter ed instructor, if you are an instructor, you've got a classroom full of kids. And by the way, my father used to be a hunter ed instructor. So he used to instruct people on hunting laws, shooting, to get their hunter ed license, that kind of thing. If one of your students commits a crime, the instructor can be held liable for the crime of his student. Now, granted, this one's a little bit more of a gray area. They're saying that it looks as though, based on the way that this law is worded, that it could potentially lead that way because it's not tight. So it's not saying necessarily this would happen, but it's saying that door is open now to that at least being considered by a court of law. They don't want people to have guns. They don't want people to use guns. And this is also indicated by, now remember, they keep saying, no, we're not talking about handguns, which are used for personal defense. We're talking about specifically big, scary assault rifles. except they also have a law on pistols that says you can only buy one in a month. What if you're somebody that has just gone through domestic abuse and you've never owned a gun in your life, but you're really afraid that your ex, let's say that you're a woman and you're afraid that your ex might come to hurt you. You want one pistol for personal protection. You want another pistol for the car and another pistol for the home. Well, you would have to wait 3 months to acquire all 3 of those pistols. Through no faults of your own, nothing that you've done, you cannot then acquire more than one handgun per month. And then another one that it's not really part of this package, but one that has been floated by Northam, is a red flag law. Now, there's a myriad of problems with red flag laws. I don't even have time to go over how many ways that they're unconstitutional, but suffice it to say that those of you that are familiar with the subject matter, you know that what this eventually means is they can basically take away your guns just based on suspicion that you might have done something wrong. And so you can see very quickly why this thing is such a nightmare and why there were so many people that were legitimately very concerned about these laws and whether or not they would be passed. So that really brings us to the next part of this, which is we now know all the lead up that led to this rally. How did the rally go? Well, no violence, no crimes, not even threats or breaches of Northam's rule. See, that was one of the things that I kind of hinted at before. Isn't it amazing that Northam, through a completely contrived manner, just declared a state of emergency basically because he didn't like the fact that there were going to be a whole bunch of people that happened to be exercising their constitutional right not only to keep but to bear arms, which means to carry, on state grounds, declares this phony baloney state of emergency. And even though everybody there knew it was a sham, that he was trying to castigate the narrative, he was trying to get ahead of this and cast them in the worst possible light, there was still nobody there, no matter how mad they were, no matter how radical they were, that broke Northam's unreasonable rule. It was ridiculous. It was a sham. And I'm guessing that pretty much everybody that showed up there would have told you that if you had asked them if you thought that that was a fair thing to do, and they would have said no. Didn't matter. They still didn't cross the line or break Northam's rule. They all hung out around the protest area, outside looking in on the state grounds because they didn't want to be in violation of that rule. See, this is the kind of people that gun owners typically are. Remember that we did episodes on this a while back where they did a survey of different people, construction workers, off-duty police officers, men, women. They broke it down by race on the different people that committed crimes. And the demographic that they found that committed by far the least amount of crimes were concealed carry permit holders. Even more so than off-duty police officers. These are people that are law-abiding and peace-abiding, the vast, vast majority of them, even more so than any other demographic in the country. They follow the rules, even when those rules are ridiculous and unfair. And that's one of the things that I was so proud of, is that they had far more firepower and far more manpower. They said that there were roughly 20 to 22,000, I think was the last estimate that I heard. They could have easily, with their firepower and with their manpower, overpowered the police officers and the security forces there that were holding them off, per se, just standing around in a perimeter. Wouldn't have been hard for them to do, not at all. They could have easily broken through that. Wouldn't have taken a whole lot of time. There was one CNN reporter I was watching that they said that they clearly had far more firepower than the security forces there. And yet, nobody got hurt. Nobody even tried to break that rule. Not one. That's insane that they went that well. Frankly, I was expecting somebody to infiltrate, somebody to try to get in there and to break the narrative, whether they were somebody on the left or just some crazy person, because every group has some crazy people in it. Some crazy people on the right, I really expected there to at least be one or two in a crowd that size, and yet, all day long, still nothing. In fact, and this was one of the craziest things to me, not only did they not break any laws or try to commit any kind of violence or try to force their way into the grounds which they were unfairly kept out of, they didn't even leave trash. A lot of people that were there said that the streets looked cleaner after they left than they had before, because what happened is a bunch of the protesters showed up with their own garbage bags and cleaned up after the group and cleaned up after themselves. This is the kind of people these Americans are. They care about the country, they care about the community, they care about their image, and they care about following the rules and following the laws. They're not rebels that just are itching to create some kind of giant upheaval and get engaged in a civil war. That's just not the kind of people they are. And the way that the media has been casting this and trying to put that narrative out there is absolutely disgusting. And I can't, I mean, I expect it at this point, but it still burns me up that they're still trying to push this. They tried to spin it as a bunch of evil radicals, and Northam was actually at the forefront of this. In fact, this was Northam talking about how he expects violence at the rally before it started.
We're seeing threats of violence. We're seeing threats of armed confrontation and assault on our capital. But we have received credible intelligence from our law enforcement agencies that there are groups with malicious plans for the rally that is planned for Monday. This includes out-of-state militia groups and hate groups planning to travel from across the country to disrupt our democratic process with acts of violence. They are not coming to peacefully protest. They are coming to intimidate and to cause harm. State intelligence analysts have identified threats and violent rhetoric similar to what has been seen before other major events, such as Charlottesville. This intelligence comes from mainstream channels, both offline and online, such as alternative dark web channels used by violent groups and white nationalists from outside Virginia. But no one wants another incident like the one we saw in Charlottesville in 2017. We will not allow that mayhem and violence to happen here.
Now, that's Northam's statement about this, and I mean, we all know that Northam is a disgusting piece of human filth. And I say that not because of this, I say that because of his stance on abortion and that, yeah, we'll just kill babies even after they're born, whatever. You know, if the mom doesn't want it, I don't care if it's born and already in the other room. We may go ahead and kill it anyway. Now, granted, that's far worse than what just happened here. But you heard how he cast it and how he tried to do it, because you'll notice in that very short clip that I showed, and granted, I did edit a little bit for time, but I think the full clip was only about 3 minutes, where he was talking there 3 times. He mentioned Charlottesville, white nationalism. He tried to cast this group as being the same group, the hate group that was there in Charlottesville that wound up killing somebody, that were marching and saying Jews will not replace us and all this other garbage. They're not the same group. And you'll say there that these people are not coming to peacefully assemble. They are coming here to do harm. And yet, even after all that, not even a single incident, not even one crazy person in the crowd causing trouble. That's absolutely astounding. And by the way, when this happened, Northam tried to save face because, I mean, it was super obvious at this point that Northam could not have possibly been more wrong if he had tried to be, and yet he still tried to save face on Twitter with this graphic. So this is him after the protest saying, "We are all thankful today that passed without incident. The team successfully de-escalated what could have been a volatile situation. I will continue to listen to the voices of Virginians and will do everything in my power to keep our Commonwealth safe." You know, I think that tomorrow the Earth is going to be hit by an asteroid, and it's going to cause the entire world to go extinct. And just so you know, if that doesn't happen, what I'm going to do is go around on Twitter telling everybody, hey guys, I saved the world, you're welcome. I saved it from that giant asteroid that I made up out of nothing. And you should all, really be thanking me, and I'd like to express gratitude for my team that handled the asteroid situation. Look, nobody was ever in danger. You didn't de-escalate something because something has to be escalated before it is de-escalated. There wasn't an incident where people were about to riot, and then all of a sudden, Northrum's team stepped in and calmed them down. That never happened. And frankly, if there had been people there trying to do something bad or looking for trouble, there's really nothing Northrum's team could have done. As armed as they were, and as many of them as there wouldn't have been a whole lot they could have done. And yet the whole day goes off peacefully. Why would Northam say something like this? Why is it that Northam would say that it had to be de-escalated? Because you would, like I said, assume that it would have to be escalated to be de-escalated. You see, in the mind of Northam and other leftists, a person merely having a firearm, or for the most part, I would say to most leftists, a person just having ideas that are different than theirs, but for the sake of staying in context and staying on topic, we'll say the idea of a person even having a firearm is an act of violence. The idea that anybody would even want a gun, that means you must automatically be a violent person that cannot be trusted. You can tell this in their rhetoric, you can tell it in the way that Northam just tried to classify the gun rights advocates. They think that just having a gun, you must be a troublemaker, you must be trying to do something, you must be up to something. See, in their mind, it needed de-escalation because merely having guns present, that is escalation. They really do think about it the way that they cast it whenever there's some kind of violent shooting or something. That the problem is the gun, not the person. The reason that nobody was hurt through this whole episode is because, yeah, there were tons of people with guns there. There was nobody there that wanted to hurt anybody. The difference was the people, not the guns. Because if guns equaled violence, well, that thing should have been a bloodbath. But there wasn't because the people didn't want to cause any trouble. That's the thing that Northam and his buddies on the left cannot understand. And by the way, Alyssa Milano jumped on this bandwagon too. This is one of my favorite tweets of the day from her. Alyssa Milano, this is what's happening in Virginia right now. Trump's America, hashtag I stand with Virginia. Now, this thing is a video that played on her Twitter, but the thing that's funny about this is apparently she has some issue with people just marching with the guns. Again, this goes back to the idea that I was talking about just a second ago. People on the left, they really do view merely having a gun as an act of violence. Just having a gun around you is some kind of violent thing because, I don't know, it hurts their feelings or makes them uncomfortable. It hits them in the feels. I don't know. But either way, they see that as something that is automatically bad, even if they're not doing anything wrong. Look, I disagree with people vehemently on a number of issues. But I don't assume that just because somebody happens to be wearing, I don't know, an Obama t-shirt or a Planned Parenthood pin or something like that, that they're committing an act of violence and they must be stopped. That's just not how I think. Apparently the left does not extend that same courtesy to us. And I think my favorite version of this, and this will be the last one that we do, actually comes via CNN. And I know that look, I'm not trying to target CNN whenever I do segments like this. It's just that CNN keeps stepping in it, and because it's my job to point that out, I have to do so. So this is CNN.
Ahead of today's demonstration, the governor declared a state of emergency and banned all weapons on Capitol grounds. But outside that secured area, many demonstrators were heavily armed. Look at them. They look like soldiers there, some wearing body armor.
All right, so that's Bill Hennessy of CNN talking about how outrageous it is. It's like, look at them. They look like soldiers. They have body armor on. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, it makes even less sense to be worried about body armor than guns because as ridiculous as some of their reactions to this have been, at least a gun is a weapon capable of hurting you. Body armor is a defensive mechanism. And another thing, too, even though there were no credible threats of violence, remember that the media all weekend had been saying there's going to be violence at this thing. This thing's going to be violent. There's going to be a bloodbath. And what's hilarious to me is the same media that was warning people to stay away because it's going to be violent, you need to be careful. The same people that said that are like, and then they're wearing body armor. Oh gosh, what are they? Well, if you were reporting that there would be violence at this thing, why wouldn't they wear body armor? Like, you would think if that were the case, that body armor would kind of make sense. And to show how ridiculously unviolent this was, there was a group, and I couldn't find the video again, but they were airing it, I believe, on CNN, if I'm not mistaken, maybe ABC News, but it was on CNN where they had Antifa counter-protesters going through, and there was like 5 or 6 of them, so not many, but Antifa protesters going right through the crowd. And yeah, there were people that they got into a verbal altercation with and they would yell at, but the thing that you notice about that is the Antifa people still felt safe enough to wade through a sea of people with guns, despite the fact that the Antifa people were convinced that the people were going to hurt them. No, you wouldn't do that. The Antifa people must have believed that they would have been perfectly safe, or they would have never done that. And so, them trying to cast these people as violent extremists, and here's something that I think Bill Hennessy might not have considered. Maybe they were soldiers. In fact, in that same CNN report, just a few minutes later, his own on-the-field reporter reported that there are several police officers, ex-police officers, law enforcement, and military present in the crowd. So maybe the reason they look like soldiers is because they might actually be soldiers. Maybe Bill Hennessy should have thought about that before he ran his mouth. But it doesn't end there. Bill Hennessy continues on with this ridiculousness. Here he is.
All we want to do is to be able to defend ourselves, not only from, violent criminals, but from a government that would usurp the Constitution as well.
So, you hear what he says about that, and there's a lot of people that feel that way. He said he doesn't mind some measures to control guns, but he says, for the most part, that the government should stay out of that realm because of the Second Amendment. And you do have folks here from all over the country. You have folks from Ohio, from Georgia, from Arkansas, lots of folks here, and so far, a peaceful rally. Jim?
Well, in this comment there, you appear to be saying the right to use guns against the government, if in his view that it's violating the Constitution.
Well, there's CNN's Bill Hennessy. Yeah, that guy that you were talking to, it almost seemed like he was suggesting that people, he's defending the right to use guns against the government. Yeah, you moron, that's the reason we wrote the freaking thing. Have you never read the Constitution? I mean, I've read it quite a few times, and the Second Amendment is kind of one of the shorter ones. And it says a well-regulated militia being necessary. So a well-regulated militia being the reason that the Second Amendment is put together, which means it's not self-defense. I mean, sure, that's part of it, but that's not the reason the Second Amendment was written. It's not about hunting. It's not about sport shooting or going out and having fun with your family shooting skeet. None of that. The reason the Second Amendment exists is for one thing: to use against a tyrannical government. Those other things are nice to have guns for, but they're not the reason the Second Amendment was penned. The Second Amendment has one reason for existing, and that is to use as a counter by the citizens on an oppressive government. It's written in the freaking bill that that's the reason that this thing is in here. And Bill Hennessy just, clutch my pearls and fan myself. Oh gosh, he's talking about maybe using guns against the government someday if they go AWOL and break the Constitution. Well, yeah, that's the whole reason that the thing's in there. I mean, it would be like being upset. It's like, he's talking about free speech even if it's something that the government doesn't like. Well, yeah, that would be the only reason that we would have the First Amendment in the first place, is so we could have free speech the government doesn't like. Surely the government wouldn't be censoring speech that the government likes. That wouldn't make any sense. The only reason to have a Second Amendment is to use as a check against an oppressive government. And anybody that has done, I don't know, more than 15 seconds worth of reading on the purpose of the Second Amendment understands that. And what's hilarious to me is you've got everybody from Northam to CNN trying to squeeze in this rhetoric about Nazis and white supremacists. Here's the thing that they forget. The Nazis were for gun confiscation. It's one of the first things they did. First, they confiscated them from the Jews, then they confiscated it from their own citizens, the people that weren't Jews. And then they had control of all the guns. That was one of the very first things that Hitler did. And so it's hilarious to me they keep trying to equate these guys as Nazis and white supremacists, which isn't true, and then try to equate them to that despite the fact that if they knew history, they would know that the Nazis are the ones that are in favor of gun control, not against it. In this scenario, Northam and the Democrats in the House and Senate are far closer, policy-wise, to the Nazis than any of the people in the crowd there are. That's just a historic fact. There's no way to argue against that. But the reason that I said at the beginning of this whole thing that this is the most important story of the week is this. As important as the Second Amendment is, and it is, it's our second most important right for a reason. But as important as it is, what's more important is what this represents. This fight represents the struggle between your elites and your average citizen. And to prove my point, this is a graphic of the sanctuary cities and sanctuary counties for the Second Amendment in the state of Virginia. And so one thing that you'll notice here, because everything that's in purple there are places where the sanctuary laws passed, everything in red is where it was rejected, and then you'll also have some white areas where that's still kind of in question. What do you notice there? There's an awful lot of purple. How is it even possible? How is it even possible that this legislation is even being contemplated, being pushed through, when you have that much of the state against it? It's because all of the places where it has been rejected are population centers that are primarily controlled by a handful of elites in a small area, dictating to the rest of the people of the state what they are and are not allowed to possess. That's the problem. Just like the feudal era of old, where you had a handful of people in the capital, in their ivory towers in a castle, dictating to the entire rest of the country what they are and are not going to do and what they are and are not allowed to have. That's what we have going on right now in the state of Virginia, and in a lot of ways nationwide to one degree or another. You've got a handful of people that consider themselves elites in the cultural centers and the cultural population areas that want to dictate to everybody else how they're going to live. And if you don't believe it, you're like, oh, you're overblowing it. They don't want to tell us how to live. They just happen to have a difference of opinion on this one particular issue when it comes to guns. Why would you be so interested in removing a person's guns if you didn't want to tell them how to live? Because if you stay out of their way and they stay out of yours, then there's no reason for that gun to be a concern unless you want to start abridging some of their other rights. You see, the reason that the Second Amendment is there in the first place is because the founders understood that that was the safeguard against all the other rights, the ones in the First Amendment that they just put down. Freedom, press, assembly, speech, petition, all of those things needed to be safeguarded, and the Second Amendment was the backdrop in case that first one didn't work out. That's what this is all about. A bunch of pointy-headed nerds, and I say that as someone who considers himself a nerd, thinking that they know what's best for the rest of the population, and so they have to disarm them so that they don't get their feathers up and don't get the hair on the back of their neck standing up, and might actually think about striking back when they tell them how to live their life. That's what ultimately all of this is. Because there is no other reason that you would have for wanting to disarm somebody. We're going to take a break here, and we'll be back in a minute.
Hey, where you going? Champ? Slugger? Hey, cowboy. Where you going? Where you going?
I'm going out!
Hey everybody, it's Caleb here, and I was just driving through South Alabama. I had a couple quick thoughts that I'd like to share with you. First of all, I really love it when the environmentalists tell us that there just are not enough trees, that we're killing all the trees, that there are no trees out there. As you can probably see through the window there, South Alabama is just trees. There's virtually nothing. You got maybe Andalusia, Enterprise, and Dothan, and trees, and that's pretty much it, other than Gulf Shores, which is the beach. So I genuinely believe that it should be part of our criminal justice system that any liberal that whines too much about there not being enough trees, that their sentence, their punishment for that, should be to drive through South Alabama, because they will be immediately disillusioned about this idea that there are just not enough trees left in the world. There is nothing but trees for miles and miles and miles and miles. Another thing that I wanted to bring up, and it actually made me hearken back to a comment that was made, I would say a few months ago, by Hillary Clinton, talking about how the coast, in other words, the people in California and Oregon and Washington and then New England, that they all voted for her and everybody else voted for Trump, which, you know, is true. And then she also talks about trying to essentially explain why that is. She says that, well, all the dynamic people, all the movers and shakers and the people that are making money, those are the ones that voted for me. It was the neophytes, the little people over in flyover country that voted for Trump. And goodness knows that I'm not the world's biggest Trump supporter. I didn't even vote for the guy in the first election. But one of the reasons that she lost that election in the first place, and one of the reasons that Americans in general are just so tired of that, is because there is a large contingency of the left that genuinely believes that only people in the cities are the ones that are dynamic and important. And I'm driving through South Alabama, and right now it's mostly just trees, but especially when you get a little bit further north. I was driving through here and I noticed there's so many fields with cattle and hay, and you get a little bit further south and you're going to see an awful lot of cotton and peanuts and some soybeans. And so I really do think, and I think that this is important to remember, that though there are people in the cities that tend to vote Democrat and have never seen a farm, have never been through, quote unquote, the flyover country, I think it's incredibly important for us to remember that, yeah, they may look their nose down at people like that, but if you were to actually take one of those people and have them try to survive in an environment where there were not the people producing their food and their fiber in states like Alabama, that those cities would immediately devolve into chaos and die. And I think it's so hilarious that the people in cities look down their nose at people in the country, people in farmland, that kind of thing, and then they wouldn't even be able to begin to have a similar lifestyle that they do if it were not for those people. And maybe I'm thinking about this because I'm an ag major and state convention for the Alabama FFA is coming up. But what it really all boils down to is that whether they appreciate it or not, whether or not they understand the relationship between their life and what they're doing and people in places like this that provide the lumber for the house that they live in or the building that they work in, and provide the cotton for their clothes and provide the food that goes on their table, they would quickly learn an appreciation once that stuff went away. Once they realized that the magic bread fairy doesn't just bring bread to the supermarket, that there are people involved in the growth and production and transportation of that, I think it would really paint it in a different light. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that it's productive for us to go out and talk about how silly and stupid they are and how ridiculous their position is on that, even though there's some truth to it. I think we do better catching more flies with honey than vinegar and explain to them and talk to them and educate them about the important role of Middle America to the rest of the world, to the rest of the economy, because the reason that we are an economic powerhouse, the reason that we have so many people that don't have to be involved directly in growing their own food and wondering where their food's going to come from one day to the next, the best way to do that is through education and helping them to understand that that is an important part of it. So let's just try to come at it from a diplomatic perspective, and hopefully they'll be able to realize at that point that it's important for them to appreciate the American farmer.
That was stupid.
I know it was stupid.
Really stupid.
Hey, I just said it was stupid.
And for today's Daily Dose of Stupid, yeah, it's AOC. So I know that everyone was anticipating that based on the subject matter of our show today, but it is AOC again. I know she's been in the Daily Dose of Stupid a lot, but I can't help it. There's just a lot of stupid there. So here is AOC on the Virginia gun rally.
There's this gun rights protest that's happening down in Richmond.
Right.
And
on MLK Day.
On MLK Day. But here's the image that has struck with me the most about that, is that when we go out and march for the dignity and the recognition of the lives of people like Freddie Gray and Eric Garner, the whole place is surrounded by police in riot gear without a gun in sight. And here are all of these people flying Confederate flags with semi-automatic weapons, and there's almost no police officers at that protest. So who or what are our institutions protecting from who?
Wow. As I've said before with AOC, it takes talent to be wrong that much in a short amount of time. So gets virtually everything out of her mouth completely wrong. I will give her credit, though, because I do like to start off positive. She did say semi-automatic weapons, because there are a lot of her Democrat colleagues that will either say something like automatic, fully automatic, machine gun, fully semi-automatic, as CNN said. That was my favorite one. So AOC does at least get it right in saying that it's semi-automatic weapons. Of course, that's pretty much all weapons now, but the point is, she does get that one right. So 1 gold star for her. Everything else was wrong. And first of all, it was not planned on MLK Day as some kind of statement that these were going to be a bunch of evil white supremacists and they were doing it on MLK Day to be kind of a sneer or throwing shade at Martin Luther King. In fact, there were several signs out there with the protesters that were pro-MLK, one of which that I saw that was talking about how Martin Luther King Jr. was pro-Second Amendment, and by the way, he was. In fact, in 1956, he actually applied for a gun permit and was denied by the Democrats because they're the ones that enacted gun control in the first place, and they were the ones that pretty much controlled the South where he applied for that gun permit when he did so. They were like, "Nah, Mr. King, we'll take care of you. You should really just rely on police protection for that." Essentially the same line that the Democrats are using now. Now, I don't pretend that Martin Luther King Jr. was a Republican, nor do I pretend, because, I mean, he really didn't belong to either political party. And I don't pretend that I lined up with him on everything. There were some buddies that he had that leaned a little bit more socialist on the economic side, and I think some of his economic ideas were incorrect. I don't have to agree with everything the man said, but when it came to this issue specifically, Martin Luther King was definitely on the side of the Constitution, the founders, and in this particular instance, also the Second Amendment would be included in all of that, and he believed that all people of all colors, should be able to exercise their constitutional rights. By the way, she talked about Confederate flags being flown, which, by the way, the Confederate flag, which is actually, when people say that, what they usually mean is the rebel flag, because the stars and bars that you're accustomed to, that's not the Confederate flag, never was. But anyway, Let's just pretend for a second that their history is correct there. The people that fly the rebel flag, those people are not necessarily violent. Now, we can have a debate, and I think there actually are decent points on both sides as to whether or not a modern American ought to fly the rebel flag or not. But if flying the rebel flag were an indicator that this person is violent and wants violence or has some kind of racial animus towards people, I'm sorry, but that's not going to fly, especially not with somebody like me that lives in the state of Alabama, where you can't throw a rock and not hit a Confederate flag, or a rebel flag is what they're talking about here. And, yeah, that's just not an indicator that somebody is violent. But even if it were, there still were not Confederate flags, at least none that I've been able to find, at this rally. Now, you saw a whole bunch of them at Charlottesville. You saw them all over the place there. And those were, of course, evil white supremacists that nobody wants to associate with. But you didn't have that at this gun rally. I saw plenty of American flags. I saw a few Gadsden flags. But to my knowledge, I did not see a single Confederate flag out there. Now, maybe there was one or two, but it certainly wasn't something that was prominent, because I've watched probably, I would say, at least 3 or 4 hours of just raw footage of that rally and didn't see a single one. Maybe there were a couple, but it wasn't something that was prominent. And so AOC can't even get her basic facts right. But even if there had been, that's still not violence. That's still not an incident like this, and that does not mean that person holds any sort of racial animus. You could maybe make the case that they're racially insensitive, but you can't make the case that a person just having it automatically makes them a racist. And as we said earlier in the program, they didn't pick MLK Day because they wanted it to be some kind of a statement against Martin Luther King Jr. Day. This is a rally that they've held annually for a really long time. This one just happened to be really big because the issue kind of came to the forefront and it caught fire in popularity. The people that organize this, the pro-gun organization that has this rally, has it on the same day every year, and have done so because the state of Virginia designates Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a day for people to come and meet their elected representatives. So AOC gets literally everything wrong in this. But she does make one thing that I think we can take a lesson from. She does make a comparison that I think that we ought to look at, because she's saying, it seems wrong to me that there's this huge police presence when there's a Black Lives Matter protest and you're seeing no police officers when it's a whole bunch of people like this that are a pro-gun rally. Now, again, her facts are wrong because there were actually several police officers present. But let's just pretend for a second that she happens to be in the right. I've put together a montage. We're going to do a compare and contrast. The first one here is a compilation of a bunch of news footage from Black Lives Matter protest.
To reach, because I'm seen as this angry black person, or I'm seen as, I'm seen as this rioter or this looter. Shut it down! Shut it down! It's a justified expression of anger, of frustration, of losing black life at a consistent basis.
I said I'm tired of being peaceful and tired of being calm. They've been going to war on us for over 400 years, so I ain't peaceful. I ain't no protester. I'm violent.
But by the end of the night, obviously, some emotions got maybe a little too heated.
Baltimore on fire. More than a dozen buildings and 100 cars were in flames last night, a fiery epilogue to the afternoon memorial for Freddie Gray. Watching the flames, heartbroken, the pastor whose church raised the money for the project.
Somebody who did this did not understand the investment. Somebody that did this did not understand my heart for this community. Somebody that did this doesn't know that for 8 years I've been working hard to bless this community.
And we cannot allow our city to devolve into chaos because of a small group of criminals that are moving throughout our city.
Freddie Gray's family had asked there be no more violence, but those appeals went unheard when in the late afternoon, young people, many of them high school students, began throwing rocks and bricks at police and targeting their vehicles. At times, police seemed overwhelmed, shields cracking and hurriedly reorganising lines of defence. On the street, a local DJ told us she was doing what she could to interrupt the violence.
I'm for the protesting, but in the right way.
There was a wave of looting. Crowds gathered to pull merchandise through shattered windows and doors.
A state of emergency is declared in North Carolina amid another night of unrest in Charlotte. What started out as a peaceful march in the city's uptown area quickly turned violent. Demonstrators threw objects at officers. Now, there were also reports of looting, and 2 employees at the nearby Hyatt House Hotel were assaulted by protesters. One person was shot and is in critical condition.
The National Guard called in after simmering tensions between police and residents boiled over. Take a look at this. Businesses and police cars set on fire, protesters hurling rocks at officers, and at least one of those protesters opening fire after police shot and killed a 23-year-old black man they say was armed.
As people ran for cover through smoke-filled mayhem, sounds of gunfire, the crowd targeting police.
Shots fired, shots fired. Getting injured officer here. Too many rocks coming.
This police car destroyed. Another up in flames. A gas station, an auto parts store, and a bank, 6 businesses in all torched. Businesses destroyed. 17 arrested, 4 officers hurt, a 16-year-old girl hit by a bullet in the chaos.
It was last night here in Dallas. Peaceful protests were underway after deadly police shootings elsewhere in the country. The demonstrations, though, suddenly rocked by gunfire, people running for cover. A fierce assault of gunfire. Police officers were being shot one by one, and when it was over, 14 people had been shot. 5 police officers were killed. It was the most deadly day for law enforcement since 9/11.
Hundreds of people racing for their lives. Screams and the sound of gunfire. Some hide behind. A woman runs, pushing a baby carriage. A woman runs, pushing a baby carriage. Officers towards the gunfire. They were the protectors, but also the targets.
So, there's a verse where he's talking to his disciples, and he says, "You will know them by their fruit." Black Lives Matter, there were several incidents that went off where, by and large, looking at what happened, they were largely peaceful. That happened in several cities. But as we just saw, there were several cities where that was clearly not the case. And I don't believe that all people that were at Black Lives Matter marches were like these inhuman savages, which is the only way that I know how to describe this. I mean, they left those cities looking like a war zone, like Aleppo or Kuwait or something like that, or Baghdad. But when you look at that, that might be part of the reason that there was a significant police presence, because when you start throwing rocks at cops, breaking windows, breaking open stores, setting fires, burning down houses, burning down apartment buildings, yeah, well, you can kind of see why the police say, maybe we should get involved and we should probably bring our SWAT gear and shields. I mean, it's not an unreasonable thing, AOC, for this to take place when that's what's going on in your city. And what we saw in that clip in that montage, multiple people inside the movement that were threatening violence, and then the origin of the movement, which was Ferguson, Missouri, absolutely engrossed in violence. By the way, those clips came years apart, because there were riots at the initial event, and then there were also riots later with Black Lives Matter after the trial of the police officer that was involved. And then you also have multiple incidents of violence taking place afterward, not once and not in one city, multiple times in multiple cities. So you can kind of see why the police, when they hear that something with Black Lives Matter is going to happen in their town, yeah, maybe we ought to prepare for the worst. And by the way, those were all the clips that I was able to go through and find footage for, and I probably did. This is one of the most, tape-heavy, intense ones that I did, going through hours and hours of old news footage trying to find footage for this. This is some examples of some of the ones I didn't have time to include. Protests from Black Lives Matter that turned violent in Las Vegas, in Portland, in St. Paul, and in Memphis. I mean, you could go on and on and on and on, but the point is, AOC, when you have a group like that that has a long-standing track record of violence, that has a long-standing track record of the people in charge of that group actually calling for violence, and you have the origin of the movement absolutely baptized, the origin of it is cloaked in violence. Yeah, I'm going to say that we need police officers there in full SWAT gear. And I don't think that that's an unreasonable thing to say. Now, compare what you just saw to this footage of the Virginia gun rights rally.
What you are seeing here is a scene of thousands, not hundreds, perhaps tens of thousands of people. So far, it has been very quiet. They are all here for one single reason, and that is they do not like having their rights when it comes to guns in any way stopped.
Northam out! Northam out! Northam out! Abort Northam! Abort Northam! Abort Northam! Abort Northam!
22,000 gun rights supporters came out today, many armed to the teeth, some dressed in fatigues. Others had handguns on their hips.
I carry it with me every day.
And rifles draped across their chests.
Flags held high, AR-15s slung over their shoulders. These protesters say they're here to fight for the future of their country.
Gun saves lives. I mean, it's obvious.
It's our God-given right to protect ourselves, our family.
It's America, right? We live free.
Virginia, the latest flashpoint in the gun debate sweeping the country.
I'm here to exercise the First and Second Amendment in defiance of the Soros-Bloomberg puppet that is Governor Northam, who openly brags about how they keep babies alive and harvest their organs. So I'm here in defiance of a real live ghoul that is attempting to trigger some type of civil war. He claims the gun groups here are going to hurt police. The gun groups are pro-police. It's Antifa on the left that are anti-police.
USA! 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 I want to hear you in the birdcage! We will not comply! Never! We will not comply!
Today's protest was peaceful, but that's not what authorities were expecting.
Can I ask what that patch means? This one? The one that says RWDS.
You look it up. It stands for Right-Wing Death Squad, an expression the Anti-Defamation League says is used by some on the extremist right. The crowd protesting the state's efforts to overhaul gun laws.
As Virginia goes, so does the rest of the nation. That's what I believe.
Were you nervous at all coming out here today, given that there was a fear that there might be some white supremacist groups?
They don't. One, they don't bother me. Two, I'm not afraid of anybody, to be honest. I got God in my guns, so.
Fake news! We won't comply! Look at the face! Look at the faces on this fake news! Look at his face! Shame on you! Shame on you! Shame on you! And you, and you, and you, and you!
Virginia is for lovers, not black-faced governors. Racist Ralphie's gotta go!
I'm also to remind everybody that Epstein did not kill himself. And if he had a gun, maybe he could have saved himself from suicide. We could have drained that swamp of pedophiles.
Were you able to identify any neo-Nazis or white nationalists when you were out there today?
No, not at all. And in fact, when groups like that infiltrate situations like this, typically you know it. They do make themselves public. But in this case, this wasn't the crowd for that. And we heard people who came here to demonstrate peacefully. They said that repeatedly to us. In fact, they were sort of offended about some of the buildup to this event. They were offended that those who are white supremacists were being associated with this gun rights rally. And so what we saw today were people who, yes, they were heavily armed. They were clearly trying to send a message, but we did not see anyone who professed to be a white supremacist.
Well, now there you go. In a crowd of 22,000 people, a reporter, they're somebody that is trained to observe and look through what's going on. He says, yeah, people were armed. There were a lot of people there. Not a single white supremacist in the whole thing. We couldn't find one. We were looking for them. Could not find a white supremacist anywhere in the crowd. And keep in mind, that reporter is a black dude. And you would kind of assume that if there were white supremacists around, he would kind of, know it because they would be yelling at him. And yet, despite all this, nope, not even a sign of white supremacy. In fact, when we did talk to people about that, they were offended that I even suggested that there might be white supremacists near them. It completely destroys the left's narrative that they tried to craft about this and tried to set it up. There was not an ounce of truth to it. They were trying to get ahead of this, to nip it in the bud before it ever started, and before they ever got a chance to even see what the facts on the ground were going to be, suggest that people like you that support the Second Amendment, that you are an evil, hateful, racist white supremacist, and that's the only reason that you support the Second Amendment. And then you have people actually go there and say, no, there was nothing like that. You saw in that clip that there were a couple of black people that they interviewed that they were like, no, I'm not worried about white supremacists. There's no white supremacist here. And even if they were, I'm armed. So, which is another thing. If you want to stop white supremacists, maybe you should arm some people. That might actually be beneficial. Do it the way that that guy does it. But unless you think that I'm being partial, because I did cut both of those montages, unless you think that I'm just, I'm just taking the absolute worst from the Black Lives Matter protest to counter, and then showing only the best clips from what was going on in Virginia. No, actually, I specifically went out of my way to catch as many of the negative clips, the worst clips from Virginia as I could, including the guy that's shouting at people, calling them fake news, the guy that's saying abort Northam, which, by the way, this is an interesting one. By suggesting that there was something wrong with that guy saying abort Northam, the only way that you can say that, and by the way, I don't think that that was a good thing to say. I don't think that that's a guy that is helping his cause by doing so. You kind of have to admit, though, to say that that is wrong, that saying abortion is an act of violence. Because if you don't think that an abortion is a violent thing, then there's nothing wrong with him saying abort Northam. But abortion is a violent act, and that's what I believe, and that's one of the reasons that I think it was wrong for that guy to shout at him. I also would say that Alex Jones, that's one of the few times I can remember hearing him where I don't think I disagreed with a single thing that he said. Not that I recall. I mean, Alex Jones and I don't exactly eat at the same table, but I don't think he said anything wrong in that. I thought it was funny that they kind of ran into him. And I also saw the guy that was comparing Northam to Hitler, which again, if it's a bunch of neo-Nazis, why would comparing Northam to Hitler be a bad thing? So even the worst parts of this, even the ones that would be the least palatable to the average person, that they would say that those guys are being rough or those guys are being mean, even those point to the fact that there were no white supremacist or violence in there. And ultimately, even though there were some people there that were a little, emotions were running a little bit too high and they said some things that I don't think are helpful to the cause, it was still things they were just saying. These are people that, according to their own reporters on the ground, were armed to the teeth, certainly had the capability of doing great harm to people that they didn't like or that they didn't agree with, and not even one single attempt at violence. And we saw the newsreel that I just showed you of the protest that went on with Black Lives Matter, and there's buildings burning, cars burning, people getting hurt, people getting shot, innocent bystanders getting hit as collateral damage, police officers being murdered, and AOC wonders why there is a police presence when it comes to a Black Lives Matter protest, and there is no police presence, even though there was one, when it's a Virginia gun rally. Well, at a certain point you have to say scoreboard. I mean, that would be like saying, I really don't understand why there's a police presence when Adolf Hitler comes into town, but not when Glenn Beck comes into town. Well, Glenn Beck, even if you disagree with him, it's still just words. and there's not really a record of him coming to town and there being a problem, you could say that that record's very different when it's somebody like Adolf Hitler, or somebody that's actually known to cause violence. That's the distinction that you're seeing here. Trying to compare and equate Black Lives Matter to the Virginia gun rally, there's just no comparison. And only somebody as brainless as AOC could have tried to make that comparison, because in making such a comparison, she shows how terrible her side is when you actually dig into it. The best that they could do was that guy that was wearing the RWDS patch. And even that, I think, is a testament to how good the vast majority of these people were. Now, if you were watching and paying attention, the RWSD, the right-wing death squad guy, they were asking him about his patch that he had on, and he would not answer them. According to the reporter, he was one of the extreme people on the outskirts, not actually in the protest. And he didn't even want to tell the reporter what it stood for. Which leads me to believe that this guy showed up. Maybe he is a white supremacist or somebody that's an extremist on the right. I don't know. Either way, he still didn't try to do anything dangerous or didn't try to hurt anybody. But he showed up to the protest, covered it up, tried to keep it concealed beneath his vest. You could only see the very top part of it. And then when the reporter asked him what it was, he's like, oh, just look it up. I don't want to answer that. That guy, who probably was an extremist, felt uncomfortable in a crowd of gun rights supporters. See, if anything, that's a great testament. The Black Lives Matter people, the most radical, were the ones leading. The ones that were most radical were the ones in the center of the crowds, leading the chants and leading people to commit these acts of violence. At this rally, the only extremist that they could find not only didn't commit violence, but he felt uncomfortable in that crowd. So much that he tried to hide that patch. There's just no comparison between the two of them. And what this whole thing displays is this, because you saw in the Black Lives Matter thing that there was all kinds of violence, all kinds of property damage, all kinds of people getting hurt. And the vast majority of those people, some did have guns, like the snipers in the Dallas police shooting. Several of them just had rocks or Molotov cocktails, everyday items that are not guns. And yet they caused all that damage, all that violence. The difference is the people. The people in Virginia had all kinds of guns. Could have done far more damage if they wanted to. They didn't want to. That's the difference. The difference is the person, not the gun. That's what AOC will never understand. Because the people didn't want to do anything bad. No bad was done. The guns don't make people evil. The people are the ones that make bad decisions and do evil things. And if you want a clear-cut example of that, you could find no better one than comparing Black Lives Matter to the Virginia gun patriots. All right, let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Our chaplain's report today comes from the book of 1 Kings, and to understand this passage, you need to understand sort of the players in the situation that is happening here. So, this passage takes place after King Solomon has passed, and his son Rehoboam has taken over. So he puts his son on his throne, and this is at the time where Israel is a united kingdom. At this point, they have had Saul, and they have had, I believe, Saul's son Ithamar sitting on the throne. But the kingdom was kind of divided at that point between the seat of Saul and David. And then David unites the kingdom. And then Solomon continues ruling that united kingdom. And then comes Rehoboam. Rehoboam is the king's son, not quite as wise as his father, but still somebody that seems to have some wisdom. and he learned at his father's feet, so you would think that he would be a pretty wise person. Rehoboam gets together with his advisors and tries to decide, what kind of king do I want to be? And three groups of people, I should say, consult with him. First, the people consult with him. He asked them, okay, people, what kind of king would you want? What kind of king would you want me to be? And they said, be somebody that eases up on the yoke, and because Solomon kind of drove us hard from time to time, and it was grievous to us, so if you could just back off a little bit, that would be something that we would find very helpful. And then you also have the second group, the elders. Now, when Solomon met with the elders, what the elders counseled him to do was to listen to the words of the people. These were people that also advised Solomon, maybe even some that advised David. Probably not because of how long Solomon's reign was, but, possibly people that have been around even since the time of Rehoboam's grandfather that have seen things like this come and go. And they said, yeah, you should probably pay attention to them. You should probably hear them out and do what they ask. And then finally you have Rehoboam's friends. These are people that Rehoboam has grown up with, that are just buddies of his. And what they say is, no, you don't want to be seen as a weak king. What you want to do is you want to go and you want to be actually harsher than they were beforehand. And Rehoboam kind of sits around for a few days listening to the counsel of these different groups. And eventually he does come to a conclusion and reaches a decision, and that comes in 1 Kings 12, 13 through 15, which says, the king answered the people harshly, for he forsook the advice of the elders, which they had given him. And he spoke to them according to the advice of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for it was a turn of events from the Lord, that he might establish his word, which the Lord spoke to Ahijah the Shilamite, to Jeroboam the son of Nebat. So when Rehoboam comes to this crossroad, he eventually decides not to listen to the people, not to listen to the elders, to listen to his friends. And because he wants to puff up his own ego and be seen as this great king and to do what he wants to do and accomplish what he wants to accomplish, he says, no, I'm going to do the opposite of what the people want. I'm actually going to drive harder. And what's important to understand about this is the reason that it's so wrong for a handful of people to ignore the other people is because mankind was not meant to have that kind of power over other people. You'll remember that God didn't even want a king in Israel. It was years and years, decades, before God finally relented to the children of Israel because they wouldn't shut up about it and gave them a king. God's plan was always for him to be the king and them to just follow God's laws and to listen to the judges when disputes came up. So there was a legal system, there was a criminal judgment system, there was a civil judgment system, but ultimately God was the one that was in charge, and Israel was a nation of laws, not of men. That changed when Saul took the throne. Not because of Saul, because Saul actually started out pretty good. But power tends to corrupt. And you look through all the history, God predicts this when it originally comes, that there would be really horrible kings. There was not a single good king in Israel. There were some good kings of Judah. And you have David and Solomon that overall definitely had their mistakes and still caused Israel a great deal of pain and suffering, but were still pretty good kings. And then you have a handful of other kings that there's some nice things said about: Hezekiah, Uzziah, Josiah. So you have a handful of good kings, but the vast majority of them were nightmares. And it's because mankind cannot be trusted with that much power over other human beings. And I'm saying this universally. I can't, King David couldn't, King Solomon couldn't, even the good kings that God lists as somebody that did try to follow God. They were human beings, they were flawed, they made mistakes, and those mistakes cost people in the long run because nobody's supposed to have that kind of absolute power over other people. And what happened with Rehoboam is the same thing that in a lot of ways is happening in our country and in other countries right now. A handful of elites that think they're smarter and better and wiser than everybody else comes together and makes decisions about other people's lives in their country. They think, you know what, if we can just get together, we can solve all the world's problems. We know better than all those little peasants out there in the flyover country. We're going to fix it. We'll handle it ourselves. We'll tell the people what they need, and we'll be the ones that lead this country. Rehoboam could have been a great king. He could have been a great king. All he had to do was listen to the people and listen to elders that had experience and wisdom beyond what he and his, essentially his frat bro buddies, and I say this as a frat boy, so keep that in mind, but a bunch of his knuckle-headed young friends were telling him to do. And what happens in the Bible tells us as a direct result of this is that the kingdom was divided. Because when the children of Israel in the northern kingdom heard this, they said, look, we don't really hold a lot of, special place in our heart for Rehoboam anyway, and we don't really want to ally ourselves with him anymore. And so they split. The kingdom was never the same after that. The kingdom never got reunited. And eventually the northern kingdom was taken captive by Syria. The southern kingdom was taken captive by Babylon. I have no idea how different Israel's history would be if Rehoboam had just done the smart thing and actually listened to what the people had to say. Even if he wound up reaching a different decision, ultimately, the fact that he refused to listen says a lot about the kind of person that he was and the reason that he will always be remembered as the king under which the kingdom of Israel split and never really came back. That's Rehoboam's legacy. And when you understand that, you can see how thinking that you're so much better or smarter than all of the people out there and that you don't have to listen to other people, because most of us are never going to be in the position where we're like that. We should always avoid thinking that we ought to be in a position of power like that, to where we can just tell other people how they should run their lives. But even if the vast majority of us never are, it's always important for us to remember this. This is the takeaway for the average person that's not going to have this level of influence. Show some humility. Remember that you don't have it all figured out, and listen to other people. There's a reason that God's word tells us that there is a wisdom in a multitude of counsel. There's a reason that the kings that tended to listen to lots of other people and other opinions tended to do a lot better than the ones that didn't. There's a reason that there are whole sections of the Bible that talk about trying to find reconciliation with others, and a big step of that is talking to them and listening to them. You see, ultimately, the reason that we talk to one another, we bear another's burdens, we confess our sins to each other, is because God understood there was a wisdom in taking the assumption that we don't have it all figured out. We are a more godly person, we are more like Christ when we assume that, you know what, we're not the smartest person in the room, we're not going to be able to figure everything out. Even if we are the most intelligent person in the room, that doesn't necessarily mean we have all the answers. Humbling ourselves and trusting on others, and more importantly, trusting in God, that's the way that we find true wisdom. And unfortunately, that's something that King Rehoboam never really understood. So let's take a lesson from this and not be like him. Let's open ourselves to the opinions, the thoughts, and the concerns of others. That will make us more empathetic, more sympathetic, and allow us to live more like Christ lived. Because remember, Christ could see into the hearts of men. He knew what people's problems were before they even said them, but he still made it a point to listen anyway, even though he already knew all of that, because it made those people feel important, and it made them more apt to listen to him when he imparted his wisdom to them as well. That's how to follow in the footsteps of Christ. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ.